History recalls Machiavelli as the individual who instructed authority on wickedness, the mentor of the devil, the skeptical demolisher of ethics. But what if his infamous image conceals a far more perilous reality? The genuine controversy surrounding Machiavelli isn't that he encouraged leaders to be wicked. It's that he revealed how our treasured ideas of virtue are meant to falter in the actual world. And that's a reality we still struggle with 500 years on. When Machiavelli penned, "It is essential for a ruler who aims to keep his status to understand how not to be virtuous," he wasn't applauding dishonesty. He was identifying a deadly inconsistency at the core of governance, one that clarifies why dreamers frequently fail while the unscrupulous succeed. Modern neuroscience has validated what Machiavelli suspected through observation. Humans don't truly desire genuinely ethical leaders. We want leaders who exhibit morality while doing whatever is required to safeguard us. We're neurologically inclined to penalize truthful realists while rewarding deceivers who feed us soothing falsehoods. That's the perilous reality Machiavelli uncovered. And once you comprehend it, you'll never view power, ethics, or human nature the same way again. For ages, thinkers had composed manuals for rulers based on how things ought to be. Machiavelli did something groundbreaking. He documented how things truly are. He witnessed firsthand how political idealists met brutal ends while pragmatic operators endured. His renowned work, The Prince, wasn't crafted for despots, but for realists attempting to navigate the contradiction between public morality and effective action. Most individuals completely misinterpret Machiavelli because they've never actually read him. They know him through caricatures, not his actual words. The real Machiavelli doesn't endorse cruelty or deceit as virtues in themselves. He treats them as unfortunate necessities in specific situations where conventional morality leads to disaster. Consider his most infamous advice that it's better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. Sounds monstrous until you grasp his reasoning. Love is conditional and evaporates in crisis, while fear is reliable. When everything falls apart, people abandon those they claimed to love, but consistently obey those they fear. This isn't cynicism. It's psychological realism backed by 5 centuries of subsequent research, and this brings us to the central contradiction Machiavelli identified. Societies praise mercy, honesty, and generosity in public discourse while unconsciously demanding their leaders sometimes be merciless, deceptive, and strategically stingy. The idealist who follows conventional moral teaching to the letter paradoxically becomes the enabler of greater evil by failing to stop those with fewer scruples. This is what Machiavelli meant when he observed that the way men live is so far removed from the way they ought to live that anyone who abandons what is for what should be learns his ruin. Consider the Pazzi conspiracy of 1478, which Machiavelli studied closely. Lorenzo de' Medici survived an assassination attempt and captured the conspirators. He executed the leaders but showed mercy to many participants. This display of enlightened mercy was celebrated by contemporaries as proof of Lorenzo's virtue. What these admirers missed was that this same mercy allowed the conspiracy's masterminds in Rome to regroup and strike again. Lorenzo's goodness cost Florence decades of stability. The opposite scenario played out when Cesare Borgia took control of the unruly Romagna province. He initially appointed a cruel lieutenant, Ramiro de Orco, to establish order. Once Ramiro had suppressed the chaos through brutal methods, Cesare had him publicly executed, displaying his bisected body in the town square. This simultaneously distanced Cesare from the cruelty while ensuring everyone understood the consequences of challenging authority. The result: peace and stability that benefited common citizens far more than well-intentioned weakness would have. What made Machiavelli truly dangerous wasn't advocating for evil, but exposing our collective hypocrisy about power. We publicly demand saints for leaders, but privately require them to be effective by any means necessary. We want the protection secured through violence while maintaining the luxury of moral outrage about how it's achieved. Modern psychological research has revealed the neural mechanisms behind what Machiavelli observed. Studies on moral decision-making show we use different brain regions when considering hypothetical versus real-world dilemmas. In the abstract, we're utilitarian, willing to sacrifice one to save many. But when faced with concrete choices requiring direct action, our emotional responses override calculated reasoning. We condemn in others what we would likely do ourselves under sufficient pressure. Machiavelli's most misunderstood idea is his concept of virtue. Not virtue in the conventional moral sense, but effectiveness in achieving desired outcomes. A leader with virtue knows when traditional morality serves the greater good and when it must be temporarily suspended for that same greater good. This isn't moral relativism, but a higher form of consequentialism that recognizes the tragic nature of power. The true scandal that made Machiavelli's name synonymous with evil wasn't that he advocated for cruelty. It was that he stripped away our comforting illusions about how the world works. He revealed that conventional morality often functions not as a guide to good, but as a mechanism of control, a way to make the powerless accept their position through rules their rulers cannot always follow if they wish to remain rulers. Consider how we judge political figures today. We claim to want honest politicians, yet systematically punish those who tell uncomfortable truths. We demand both moral purity and effective protection from threats. And we reserve our greatest contempt not for the corrupt, but for those who acknowledge the messy compromises power requires. This is the psychological contradiction Machiavelli identified. We need our leaders to sometimes operate outside conventional morality, but we cannot psychologically tolerate acknowledging this necessity. So we develop elaborate fictions about power that let us enjoy its benefits while condemning those who provide them. The clearest modern example is how democracies handle national security. Citizens demand both perfect security and perfect moral adherence from their intelligence agencies and military. This impossible standard creates a necessary system of official lies, operations that cannot be acknowledged, decisions that cannot be transparently defended, and truth that cannot be publicly stated. What would happen if a political leader followed conventional morality to the letter in dealing with hostile powers? They would place their citizens at catastrophic risk, yet we maintain the fiction that power can be exercised without moral compromise. This is why Machiavelli distinguished between the effectual truth, how things actually work, and the imagined truth, how we pretend they work. The gap between these truths is where both political disaster and opportunity reside. But Machiavelli wasn't just describing a problem, he was offering a solution. His remedy wasn't abandoning morality, but developing a more sophisticated understanding of it. True morality, in his view, considers outcomes rather than just intentions. It recognizes that sometimes the apparently good choice produces evil results, while the seemingly harsh choice prevents greater suffering. Consider his analysis of Hannibal, who maintained discipline over a diverse army through inhuman cruelty. Machiavelli notes this cruelty, while morally questionable in isolation, prevented the greater evils that would have resulted from a breakdown in military order: mass rape, civilian massacres, and complete campaign failure. The conventional good choice would have produced far more suffering than the controlled application of fear. The sophistication of Machiavelli's actual position is why serious scholars consider him not the teacher of evil, but the first truly modern political thinker. someone who tried to derive principles from observed reality rather than abstract ideals. He recognized that political systems must account for humans as they are, not as we wish them to be. This realism extended to his understanding of human psychology. Machiavelli grasped that people primarily judge leaders by appearances rather than underlying realities. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few experience what you really are, he wrote. This wasn't advocacy for deception, but recognition of how perception functions in politics. The cognitive dissonance Machiavelli identified continues today. We still want leaders who achieve security and prosperity while pretending these goods arrive without difficult choices. We demand both effectiveness and moral purity, rarely acknowledging the tensions between them. When Machiavelli advises that a leader should appear merciful, faithful, humane, religious, and honest while being prepared to act otherwise when necessary, he's not advocating for systematic deception. He's highlighting the psychological contradiction in our expectations. We want the outcomes that sometimes require harsh measures while insisting our leaders adhere to principles that would prevent those outcomes. This is the heart of what makes his insights so dangerous. Machiavelli doesn't just challenge conventional morality. He exposes how we use it as a psychological shield against confronting the true nature of power and security. We can maintain our moral self-image by condemning Machiavellian behavior while benefiting from the stability it provides. The real lesson of Machiavelli isn't that goodness should be abandoned, but that our understanding of it needs to mature beyond simplistic formulations. True goodness considers the full consequences of actions, not just their surface appearance. It acknowledges the tragic dimension of power that sometimes all available choices involve some degree of moral compromise. What would a mature Machiavellian ethics look like? It would start by acknowledging that the moral purity we demand from leaders is often incompatible with the protection and prosperity we expect them to provide. It would recognize that the gap between public morality and effective governance isn't a failure of character, but a structural feature of political reality. Most importantly, it would admit that our desire to believe in simple moral solutions to complex problems makes us vulnerable to exploitation. We prefer leaders who tell us comforting lies about clean hands rather than those who speak honestly about necessary compromises. The enduring power of Machiavelli's analysis is evident in how thoroughly modern research has validated his core. In Insights, game theory has formalized what he intuited, that conventional moral strategies fail against opponents who don't share your constraints. Evolutionary psychology has confirmed his observations about human nature. Even neuroscience supports his understanding of how we process moral choices differently in theory versus practice. But perhaps most significantly, history has repeatedly demonstrated what happens when idealists refuse to engage with Machiavelli's uncomfortable truths. Time and again, well-intentioned leaders who reject Machiavellian thinking have enabled far worse outcomes than pragmatists willing to make difficult moral compromises. The ultimate irony is that by demonizing Machiavelli, we perform exactly the kind of self-deceptive moral theater he identified. We pretend power can be exercised without moral cost. We condemn those who speak honestly about its compromises while benefiting from the security those compromises provide. 500 years after he wrote The Prince, we still haven't fully reckoned with Machiavelli's dangerous truth, that our conventional understanding of goodness often fails in collision with reality, and that this failure doesn't just undermine effectiveness, but often produces greater evil than the moral compromises we so fear. The question isn't whether Machiavelli was right about this fundamental tension between conventional morality and effective governance. History has unequivocally confirmed he was. The question is whether we can finally develop the moral maturity to acknowledge this tension rather than taking refuge in comforting illusions. Imagine if we stopped expecting our leaders to pretend they can guarantee security, prosperity, and moral purity simultaneously. What if we demanded honesty about trade-offs instead of reassuring fictions? What if we recognize that the true moral failure isn't making difficult compromises, but refusing to acknowledge their necessity? This is why Machiavelli matters more today than ever. In a world of increasingly complex threats and polarized discourse, we desperately need to close the gap between how we talk about power and how it actually works. We need a more sophisticated moral framework that acknowledges reality rather than retreating into idealistic fantasies. The alternative is to continue our collective hypocrisy, condemning Machiavellian behavior while tacitly requiring it, demanding moral purity while expecting perfect security, and punishing honest leaders while rewarding effective hypocrites. Machiavelli's dangerous truth isn't that goodness should be abandoned. It's that our infantile understanding of goodness must be replaced with something more nuanced, more realistic, and ultimately more moral in the fullest sense. An ethics that considers consequences, not just intentions. 5 centuries ago, a Renaissance diplomat dared to describe power as it actually works rather than how we wish it worked. We've spent those centuries shooting the messenger rather than engaging with his message. But the contradictions he identified remain unresolved. Do we have the courage to finally face Machiavelli's dangerous truth? Or will we continue pretending that power without moral compromise is possible? The stability of our political systems may depend on how honestly we answer this question. But there's an even deeper dimension to Machiavelli's analysis that few discuss, one that explains why conventional morality fails precisely when we need it most. It's the insight that connects his political realism to fundamental questions about human nature itself. And it might be the most disturbing part of his dangerous truth. Machiavelli understood that human beings are not purely rational actors. We are driven by emotions, biases, and subconscious desires that often conflict with our conscious values. This understanding is crucial for grasping why conventional morality often fails in the real world. Our moral principles are frequently overridden by our emotional responses, leading us to make decisions that contradict our stated values. This insight is particularly relevant in the context of leadership. Leaders are often placed in situations where they must make decisions that have significant consequences for large numbers of people. In these situations, the emotional weight of the decision can be overwhelming, leading even the most principled leaders to make choices that they later regret. Machiavelli's recognition of this aspect of human nature is what makes his analysis so profound. He understood that the gap between our moral principles and our actual behavior is not a failure of character, but a fundamental aspect of being human. This understanding allows us to approach the study of power and leadership with a more nuanced and realistic perspective. Moreover, Machiavelli's insights into human nature have been validated by modern psychology. Studies in cognitive science have shown that our decision-making processes are heavily influenced by our emotions and subconscious biases. This research supports Machiavelli's observation that our moral principles are often overridden by our emotional responses. In light of this, it is clear that Machiavelli's analysis of power and leadership is not just a historical artifact, but a timeless insight into the human condition. His understanding of the complexities of human nature and the challenges of leadership remains relevant today, offering valuable lessons for anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of power and governance. Furthermore, Machiavelli's work challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society. He forces us to question our assumptions about morality, power, and human nature, and to consider the ways in which our idealized visions of the world often conflict with reality. This confrontation with reality is essential for developing a more mature and sophisticated understanding of ethics. It requires us to acknowledge the complexities and contradictions of human nature, and to recognize that the pursuit of moral purity is often incompatible with the demands of effective leadership. In this sense, Machiavelli's work is not just a critique of conventional morality, but a call to develop a more nuanced and realistic approach to ethics. It challenges us to move beyond simplistic formulations of good and evil, and to embrace a more complex and nuanced understanding of the human condition. Ultimately, the enduring relevance of Machiavelli's insights lies in their ability to help us navigate the complexities of the modern world. In a time of rapid change and uncertainty, his work offers valuable lessons for anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of power, leadership, and human nature. As we continue to grapple with the challenges of the 21st century, Machiavelli's dangerous truth remains as relevant as ever. It reminds us that the pursuit of moral purity is often incompatible with the demands of effective leadership, and that the gap between our idealized visions of the world and the reality of human nature is a fundamental aspect of the human condition. In conclusion, Machiavelli's analysis of power and leadership offers a profound and timeless insight into the human condition. His understanding of the complexities of human nature and the challenges of leadership remains relevant today, offering valuable lessons for anyone seeking to understand the dynamics of power and governance. By confronting the uncomfortable truths about ourselves and our society, we can develop a more mature and sophisticated understanding of ethics and navigate the complexities of the modern world with greater wisdom and insight.